reading from Exodus 20:12. Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land of the Lord your God is giving you.
There's an old Jewish story. A rabbi was traveling on an airplane and discovered that the person sitting next to him was an atheist. Sometimes you have those conversations, you learn those things about each other. And the rabbi's family was also on the plane, and every few minutes one of the rabbi's children or grandchildren would come by and ask him if he needed anything, more food or a blanket or something. And the atheist remarked, "The respect your children and grandchildren show you is wonderful. Now, mine certainly don't show me that kind of respect." And the rabbi replied, "Well, think about it for a minute. To my children and grandchildren, I am one step closer in the chain of tradition to a time when God spoke to the whole Jewish people from Mount Sinai. To your children and grandchildren, you are one step closer to being an ape." About halfway through the series now on the Ten Commandments, and today we're looking at the fifth commandment, found in Exodus 20:12, which Brian just read for us. It says, "Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you." This commandment is a reminder of that truth that rabbi not so subtly pointed out to the atheist, that this parent-child relationship is ideally seen as one link in a chain of relationships that goes all the way back to God. This commandment gives us a big picture of the whole concept of parenthood. In an issue of Leadership Journal, the editors asked 5 writers the question, what trend will have the greatest impact on the church in the next 10 years? And I believe this was over 10 years ago, but one of the 5, Lyle Schaller, who was a church consultant and author, entitled his segment, "Every Part is an I," referring, of course, to every member of the church being a part of the body of Christ, but instead of EYE, it's capital I. Every part is an I. And in his article, he answers the question, how will the body of Christ function in an age of rising individualism? In it, he says, the me generation that we've heard talk about for so long has given way to a me world. And he's right. There's no denying that people today are looking at everything almost in their whole lives through that lens of, how is this going to affect me? And don't get me wrong, this has very likely always been the case to a certain extent. But in generations past, I believe that personal considerations came to mind in the most people after there were also questions about family and about community. People would ask, how will this affect my family, my community, my country? And weigh the answers to those questions before they would necessarily ask, what change will this require of me personally? For example, Tom Brokaw wrote a book about what he calls the greatest generation, those of the World War II era. And while I believe that there were serious mistakes that were made by that generation and that they were not perfect, I would certainly agree that there was a whole different mentality back then than there is today. There was definitely more a sense of community and selflessness back then. People thought about others besides themselves. After 9/11, when all the talk of war broke out, I read about how many veterans of previous generations, who were then far beyond the age of going into combat, had immediately volunteered again to fight for their country. And that whole kind of mentality has largely been lost to today's generation. Individualism is a dominant theme in our current generation. This fifth commandment exposes the lie to the myth that is out there that many people believe, and that is that what is most important in life is me. The Bible's big picture of parenthood portrays it as a hard job, but it also says that if God grants a person that privilege, then nothing in life is more important than that. Now, I know this commandment speaks to children, and that we almost always direct this to kids, saying that the Bible tells them that they should honor their parents. And probably parents, when you saw the sermon topic this morning, you were saying, oh good, I hope my kids listen to this. But I really believe that this commandment is really meant as much for parents as it is for the children. See, obedience and respect for parents cannot be a forced thing. You can't make someone respect you. even if it's your own kids. But you can teach the concept of respect and submission to authority. And if that is properly taught, then the kids will be able to make that application of respect for their own parents. The current sad state of many child-parent relationships and the general lack of honor and respect for authority in our culture are ultimately the fault of poor parenting. And not simply that just kids are so rotten today. Teaching children to respect authority is the very thing that instills that concept of honoring your parents, even if you're not drilling it into them every moment that they should honor you just because you're their parents. Many teachers have noticed a change in dealing with children who have misbehaved in school. But the change isn't in the children, it's in the parents. It used to be that if there was a problem at school, that school officials could count on the support of parents to help deal with the problem. And the threat of going to a child's parents usually was enough to take care of discipline problems, because they didn't want that to happen. But now, more often than not, if a parent is consulted, the response of the parent is to automatically defend the child and assume the school is just picking on their kid. The parents are more concerned with whether their child's rights have been violated and assume that if someone's accusing their child of doing something, then it has to be somebody else's fault. Now, of course, parents should look out for their kids and stick up for them if they're being treated unfairly, and it can and certainly could happen. But this is a drastic departure from how things used to be. My wife will tell you that her father always told her if she ever got in trouble in school, she'd be in more trouble at home. And if a teacher said one thing and she said another, he'd believe her teacher. Now, that attitude could be taken to the extreme, of course, but generally, if a child knows that his parents are going to hold him accountable for his submission to other authority in his life, then he's going to get into a whole lot less trouble. But if he figures that his parents are going to back him up no matter what he does, then he loses respect for that authority. And ultimately, in the process, he loses respect for his own parents. Even though the parents think they are being such good support for their kids, and their kids are going to be so grateful and so loyal to them for backing them up. See, the desires of the individual have seemed to taken precedence over authority and over order, over civility and respect in our society. The police are saying the same kinds of things. In times past, if the police caught a child breaking the law, let's say, spray painting graffiti or vandalism or something like that, and then they would take the child to his home. And the parents generally would almost always thank the officer and profusely apologize and assure him that this would not happen again. But now, when they take a child that they've caught doing something wrong to his parents and they say to them, "We caught your son shoplifting or vandalizing or stealing lunch money from schoolmates," the parents are more likely to respond, "Our son would never do that. You must be mistaken. I'm calling a lawyer." You see, the individual is emphasized above all else. It seems that I is more important than you or they or even we. Now, those are just two examples that describe the failings of our society in this area of honor and respect for authority. And we could go on all day. Everyone here probably has stories similar to these, stories that provide evidence that this commandment has been terribly violated, and the whole concept of honor given to parents or to elders or to authority has just kind of gone out the window. However, to simply just stand up here and bash something and to whine and complain about it doesn't help the situation. And to blame all of our society ills on our children is an evasion of the whole subject. It misses the whole issue of what the Bible counsels us about this. In Ephesians 6, Paul reiterated the necessity of this commandment in the Christian home. In verse 1, it says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth." Again, we've talked about how all the commandments are really for our good, but here's the first one that is outlined. There's a promise that goes along with this, that this is for your good. It's for your own benefit that you obey your parents. And in old age, it is something that comes back to visit you again. But notice how quickly Paul moves to the parents' responsibility in the same area. In verse 4, it says, "Fathers, don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." So to lay the full burden of this commandment solely on the children is to miss something crucial here. And that is this, that we parents need to strive to be parents who are worthy of honor and to raise children who respect authority in general and to show honor when and where it's appropriate. A man answered his doorbell one day, and his friend walked in, followed by a very large dog. And as they began to talking, the dog knocked over a lamp and jumped on the sofa with muddy paws and began chewing on a pillow. And finally, the house owner had all he could take, and he snapped at his friend and says, "Well, can't you control your dog?" And his friend looked at him with amazement. "My dog? I thought it was your dog." At times, it seems like we have this whole process in society where people are walking around, "Why don't you control your kids? Why don't you take care of your situation? Why don't they control their kids?" when they're not looking after their own household. If we can take this commandment seriously, then we will strive to take responsibility for our children and their behavior and for what's going on in our own homes. We'll discipline them when it's necessary and not make excuses for them, nor help them to avoid responsibility when they do something wrong. It's a fine line, I know. It's a tough line that parents have to walk, trying to figure out exactly just how much is enough. Not too much of everything that goes into that mix that is successful parenting. How much discipline, how much affirmation, how much support, how much encouragement of independence is enough? How much of these things and many others is just the right amount, enough to do the job, but not too much as to have the opposite intended effect? These are very difficult questions to answer. We've all known people who seldom or never discipline their children, and usually those poor children turn out to be terrors, often having very difficult lives as adults. And yet, there's a ditch on the other side of the road that's just as deep. We know instinctively there's a truth that's saying that hostile homes produce hostile children. And I've known people who have punished their children the same way for just minor things as they would for something serious. There's no logic or sense of appropriateness to their discipline. And not surprisingly, those children too often end up rebellious and angry. So the road to being a parent worthy of honor, who raises respectful children, is full of many potholes that just tend to trip us up. And ultimately, it comes down to just doing the very best that we can, using all the wisdom that is available to us. John Roseman said this, "Parenting is not an intellectual endeavor. It does not emanate from the head. If it did, the smartest people would be the smartest parents, and I have never noticed that. Good parenting is a matter of how rooted you are in the steady soil of common sense. The heart and the gut are what make a good parent, not the head." There's a lot of truth to that. Most every couple has ideas about parenting before they have children. And if they don't, I think they should. If I'm encouraging engaged couples who are going to be married to think ahead of time about how they're going to discipline their kids and what the strategies they're going to use when they become parents. But the thing is, once you actually do become parents, all those strategies and all those things that you were never going to let your kids do and you were never going to do to your kids, they just often become an idealistic dream. Parenting is not an exact science. You can't approach it with a cookie-cutter mentality. What works for one kid may not even work for another kid in your own family. The important thing is to realize that we hold much of a child's future in our parental hands, and how they react to authority will largely be determined by how we raise them. Discipline is not the only ingredient, of course. Children will learn much by watching us and seeing how we honor and respect authority, and how we honor and respect our own parents, how we show disrespect or respect for authority. And so that brings up a valid question. How exactly do we honor our parents? What does doing that entail? What should we do or not do to fulfill this commandment? Well, honoring one's parents, in practical terms, will depend upon the age of the child and the integrity of the parents. And so for younger kids, if they do pretty much as their mom and dad say on a daily basis, they don't get too smart alecky, well, they pretty much fulfill this commandment. It's a little easier, at least when children are small, to draw those lines, to draw that line in the sand, as it were, and say, if you cross this line, you've gone too far. And so we do this taking their relative innocence and their youth into account. And a lot of the things that kids do are not meant to be disrespectful or disobedient. They're just being kids. Once a class of first graders was asked to complete this sentence. My mother cooks the best, and then they left it open, and they were supposed to probably write, what they liked that their mother cooked the best, and finish that sentence. But one little boy supplied the words, "That she can." Well, it wasn't trying to be disrespectful, he's just being a kid. And we should know the difference between willful disobedience and youthful mistakes or ignorance. So we need to be sensitive of their age and not expect too much of younger children. For older children, those still living at home but in their mid to late teens, part of that whole essence of honoring one's parents is obeying, of course, but even when you don't really have to. When you could get away with the disobedience, what you're doing at school probably isn't going to get back to them, but still, even if you don't feel there's going to be consequences, to still obey what your parents have instilled in you. That might be the real test for older kids, to see if they're really honoring their parents by doing that. Notice this commandment doesn't say, love your parents, even though you should, but that's not what the commandment says, in the sense of always having a loving and affectionate feeling about them. That's because there are going to be plenty of times when a child will not feel like they love their parents. A parent has to do things that are often uncomfortable in the short term, but which are very necessary for the long-term well-being of the child. And as an aside, sometimes there are parents who just kind of throw up their hands in frustration when a child who is near adulthood, or maybe even actually an adult already, but is living a lifestyle and doing things that are immoral or dangerous and self-destructive. And they say, well, they're too old to spank. I can't ground them at their age, so what can I do? But the crazy thing is that very often these children are still living at home, driving their parents' cars, spending their parents' money, and in such cases, parents need to simply decline to subsidize that kind of living. Give them no money or credit cards or phone or gas or monthly check. Remember an old TV show when the son told his father he wanted to get paid for doing the chores that he was doing around the house. And the father said, okay, I'll pay you. And then I'll give you a bill for your room and board and medical expenses that you've incurred since you've been living under my roof. And that shut the kid up. When the parents are paying the bills, then they can call the shots. But what about adult children? How do we honor our parents? Fulfilling God's wishes and modeling right behavior for our children. Well, showing respect is the key there. Do we speak badly about them or speak disrespectfully to them? Or do they and those around us know from our words and our actions that we esteem them and we have a special place for them in our hearts and in our lives? Also, this commandment most certainly has much to say about how we treat our elderly parents and our grandparents when they can no longer take care of themselves as they once did. I've known people who have basically put their own lives on hold for months at a time while taking care of their own sick or dying parents. Certainly they have fulfilled the spirit of this commandment. And no doubt there will be times when people need more or better care than we can possibly provide for them at home on our own, and different solutions need to be looked at. However, I've always highly respected those who have put this off for as long as possible. Now, my sister did this for my mother, and just something about this past week when she was so very ill that her adult children flew from Texas and Florida and one a busy lawyer, all put their lives on hold so that they could care for their own mother. And I think they learned that from watching their mother take care of her mom. Well, perhaps the most delicate question concerning this commandment is the issue of how does a child honor a parent whose behavior toward them was abusive? I realize that not everyone here has been blessed with parents like I had, people who were by no means perfect, but who loved me and did their best to raise me right. How much honor is due to a parent who was emotionally distant or maybe even physically abusive? Well, at times that honor may have to be reduced to the honor for the office rather than the person in the office, like we might have to sometimes do with politics. Sometimes abusive parents, when a child is grown, try to pretend that nothing happened and act like a normal, happy family. They don't apologize or try to mend the relationship, and they just want to sweep the whole thing under the rug. Well, honoring one's parents does not include going along with a lie like that. Someone has said showing honor should never require distorting the truth. It could be that the honor that you show a parent is kind of an arm's length honor. You're polite, you're respectful, you don't badmouth them to their face or in front of your children, but neither do you pretend that their abusive behavior never happened or that they've never owned up to it or or that they have owned up to it if they actually haven't. And so this question leads to a couple of warnings about this topic that I want to mention before we're through. We need warnings because people have taken certain aspects of this commandment and twisted them around or misapplied them so that they actually cause more problems than they fix. First, I would strongly encourage every adult child to be sure to not let the mistakes of your parents ruin your lives. It's very easy to find people who just go around with an attitude like this. Well, my parents messed me up because they were bad parents. I'll never be happy and live a normal functioning life and be a normal functioning member of society. Many people use their parents as an excuse to just be pitiful and unhappy and dysfunctional. Well, the truth is that even if your parents were abusive to you, you can get help about that. And eventually you can put that horror behind you. That is a huge part of the promise of the gospel message. Our past, no matter how bad it may have been, does not have to ruin our future. Not in Christ Jesus. That is the victory of living as a child of Jesus Christ. The other warning to share is that we need to be careful not to make idols of our parents. It could be just as tempting to do that. Just as it's possible to make idols of our children, it's possible to do the same thing with your parents. Often parents are so consumed with doing things for their children, they act as if they're almost worshiping their children. Their lives revolve around everything the kids are doing, and every decision is made in consideration of the children and how it would affect them. And what this actually does is to create what psychologists have called a codependency, where the children come to have the same attitude toward their parents. The Bible tells us family is important. It should be a priority in our lives. But it also makes it very clear to us that it's not our goal of life just to have a nice family, but rather it's the context that God has given us for living out a life following Christ. So the healthiest family is the one that creates the environment where children are safe and secure and dependent, but they grow up to be able to leave home and to be independent enough to raise their own families. Then when the time comes for those tables to be turned and for the parents to become dependent on their adult children, it can be done with the honor and the dignity of a lifetime habit of honoring your mother and father. Living the life of a follower of Jesus Christ is all about striking the right balances between different aspects of our lives. And right now, our culture is sending a blatant message of individualism. What I want should be the most important thing to me. But this commandment challenges us to consider the needs of such people as our parents and our children being more important than our own wants and our desires. So God's people learn to look outward before they look inward. We are a family here at Spinning Road Baptist Church. We are brothers and sisters, in some relationships almost like parents and children. And we have an opportunity to demonstrate this honor and respect for our elders and for authority right here in the midst of this family. If you would like to become a part of this family, we would invite you to make a decision to accept Christ as your Savior and to join with us as we seek to do our best to serve and honor Him. After our hymn, we're going to join together